Lesson 3 in our current scheme on levels of organisation. Now, this is what the syllabus says about that you should understand that photosynthetic organisms, things like green plants, are the producers in these food webs and food chains of biomass. Now, there's a key word that you need to know the meaning of, and we'll get to that. So you've got producers that are keywords, you've got biomass, that is a keyword, and the idea of food chains and food webs in here. You can see that you have all food chains and food webs. We'll discuss the difference in a moment or two. Begin with a producer. A producer is an organism which photosynthesizes to produce biomass. So they all start with a producer, and characteristic of producers is that they synthesize molecules like glucose. Producers are usually green plants or algae. They make glucose by photosynthesis. So that's what a producer is. I'm not going to touch this at all, the range of methods using transects and quadrats. The terms mean, median and mode, and using them. We're not going to do any using of them today, but we will define what those terms are. Plotting graphs, again, we're not going to do that today. We're going to focus on food chains, food webs, and these key terms. So the order of things: producers are eaten by primary consumers, so perhaps grass eaten by the cow. The cow then turned into food, or we drink the milk. That would make us the consumer there. But you might have a series of, a food chain of organisms where the photosynthesizing organism is eaten by something, which is then eaten by something else, which is then eaten by something else. We'll come across an example of that. Consumers that kill and eat other animals are predators. So there's a definition of what a predator is and what prey is. And then another key thing, you might well have known what a predator and a prey organism were, but stable communities are where the numbers of predators and prey are rising and falling in cycles. And again, we will look at an example of that. So, going back to what we've done before, a couple of little starters here for you. You should be able, off the top of your head, to name 2 biotic and 2 abiotic factors. And you should be able to describe how sudden changes to these factors, abiotic or biotic, lead to ecosystems becoming unstable. Now, you might not be able to think of that just off the top of your head, but what you could say is, okay, what would happen if we were to change this suddenly about an ecosystem? Take, for example, the sudden destruction of the rainforest, for example. How does that affect the ecosystem? So, think about that. If you don't know the answers, stop the video, look them up, and then start the video again, because the very fact that you've looked them up will help you remember them. But you do need to know these things. So, here are the key terms that I've pulled out from today's lesson. And as we go through, you should be looking to fill this in on the lesson sheet for today. So all of these are listed on there, and you should be filling in the meanings of these as we go. So what we're looking for: knowing about food chains and food webs, knowing that photosynthetic organisms are the producers and they're at the start of all the food chains, all the food webs that you might possibly conceive of. They produce biomass. This is organic material. So green plants use carbon dioxide and sunlight to produce glucose and oxygen. That is photosynthesis. That glucose is an organic molecule, and that's what we mean by biomass. But of course it goes on. You could look at biomass as being animal waste, at being plant material. So biomass is a broad range of things that it covers. Then looking at producers, primary, secondary and tertiary consumers in food chains, and then looking at processes that limit the amount of energy available at each trophic level. A trophic level is what we mean by producer, primary, secondary, tertiary consumer. Producers, that's a first trophic level. Primary consumers are second trophic level, and so on. So trophic level just means where you are. If you were to draw your food chain from the bottom of the page to the top of the page, you'd have levels as you go up until you get to the final tertiary consumer. Here we have a delightful picture of a parasitic worm. We will touch on parasites briefly at the end. So, simple food chains. The thing about food chains versus food webs is that you have, in a food chain, you've only got one path. The plant is eaten by the herbivore, the locust, which is eaten by the carnivore, which is eaten by another carnivore, which is finally eaten by another carnivore. Nothing eats the eagle. So the producer, you've always got a green plant or an algae down here. The producer is eaten by something which is eaten by something else. Now, it might be that that's the end of the story, but the food chain is a linear thing. It goes one plant eaten by one, in this case insect, eaten by one animal, which is eaten by another animal. Now, you would say, well, actually, this snake, this eats more than just this species of animal. And it is more than one insect that feeds on this plant. And maybe more than one species of bird eats the snake. Maybe it's not just birds that eat the snake. So you can see how this is a very simple picture, and you could have other branches off here making a more complicated picture. That would be your food web. But notice your trophic levels, as I was saying a moment or two ago. The first trophic level is always going to be your primary producer, Then your primary consumer will be your second trophic level. And then you might not have anything beyond that. If you think about grass, cow, man, that's it. But you can, of course, have other levels. So, you can see the flow, or that you can imagine that there is a flow of energy going through here. And if you think about your physics, energy is conserved, but the more times that you convert the energy, the less efficient the process is. So you can imagine then that the energy taken in by the plant from the sun and converted into biomass, that's quite efficient. But there's energy wasted in this step, and there's energy wasted in this step, and there's energy wasted in this step. So actually, the amount of the energy taken in by the plant that gets up here, the proportion is quite small. I shouldn't have said amount, proportion is quite small. So, food chains, very simple. Food webs, well, here you have the rabbit eats the grass, but so does the deer. The deer also eats foliage from the tree. The squirrel eats produce from the tree. The owl and the fox and this other species of owl, they eat squirrels, and they eat birds, and they eat insects, and they eat mice and another kind of insect. So you can see grasshoppers. You can see that this is a much more complicated but much more realistic picture. But you still have your trophic levels in here. So you've got your producer, your primary consumer, your secondary consumer, so you can see, but it's more complicated than that because it's more realistic. Don't worry about this rather messy looking picture, but this is just to show you that actually food webs are quite complicated. And sometimes the organism can be on two different trophic levels. For example, us, we might eat lettuce and be the primary consumer, but we might eat beef and be the secondary consumer. We might eat grasshoppers and be the secondary consumer. So the picture is complicated because it's realistic. But if you're looking at this going, oh my goodness, I could never draw that, well, you're not going to have to. It's this kind of thing is about as complicated as you're going to get. So here's your chance to construct a food web. So here's some information on a rock pool. Observations Monday to Friday. Shore crab eating green seaweed. You say to yourself now, is the shore crab the producer? Is it a primary or secondary consumer? What is that? Is the seaweed the producer? Is it a consumer? Sea anemone eating by catching small particles of floating plants and animals. Well, what is that? Is that a primary or a secondary consumer? Is it both? And so on. So you're looking at these and you're saying, what are these organisms in terms of level? And you're looking at trying to draw your producers here, your primary consumers on the next level, your secondary consumers on the next level. But you're allowing for the fact that a primary consumer may consume more than one producer. So this is the idea. Identify your primary producers, primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. So first, second, third, fourth consumers, if there are four. And here's a template to help you with that. So if you go back in the video, you can see shore crab, green seaweed, sea anemone, whelks, red and green seaweed, small fish, shrimps, plankton, animal plankton, plant plankton, sea anemones, more plankton. Back to the shore crabs. Shrimps, small fish, crabs, whelks, I think we had all those already. Small fish, sea anemones, seagulls, small fish and crabs. So, first thing to do, list all of the organisms. Second thing to do, decide what kind of level are they? Which trophic level are they on? Are they producers? Are they primary, secondary consumers? Tertiary, quaternary consumers? And once you've done that, you can lay them out in levels and you can put it all together, something like this. Then you can fill it in. So you get your producers on the bottom, you can fill in the gaps. So do that. This needs to be in your notes. There's a space for that on the Google Doc. So put those into your notes. Okay, so I should have gone back. That's the answer when you come to it. So, looking at the way the energy flows here, you can see the producer takes in 5,000 kilojoules, 4.5 is lost, 500 then gets taken by the primary consumer, taken in by the primary consumer. But 425 of that is lost, and 75 kilojoules goes on to the secondary consumer, and only 10% of that's moved forward. So now this is not saying that the producer is hugely inefficient. What it's saying is that the primary consumer only gets 500 kilojoules of the 4.5 of the 5,000 kilojoules, that the producer took in. 4.5 of the 5,000 is lost as heat, waste products, uneaten parts, undigested parts, waste products. So this isn't about the producer being inefficient, it's about the process of transferring the energy from the producer to the primary consumer, really. So you can see that for the amount of energy coming in to the earth, because this is where the energy is coming from, the sun, it's the producers that are capturing that energy. You can see that there has to be an awful lot of these compared to these for the system to work. Just pause and think about that. You could not have as many tertiary consumers as you have producers because they can't get enough energy. There has to be a lot more of these in order that these can exist at all. So, you see how the more links there are in the chain, the more of the energy that came in initially is being not transferred along this chain, but transferred out of the chain elsewhere. It's not that it's totally wasted, because obviously there are animals, organisms that will use the waste products, that in themselves they'll digest the uneaten parts. So if you think about a lion killing a springbok, that springbok will not be entirely eaten by the lion, but the hyenas will come along and they will eat some of what the lion has left, and of what's left after the hyenas you will have other organisms, insects, bacteria that will digest what's left. So it's not wasted, it just doesn't follow through this chain. That's the point. So here you have the lions and the wildebeest. The wildebeest, of course, are eaten by the lion, and the wildebeest eats the producer, the grass. And you can see, whilst this isn't entirely representative, it does not take this many wildebeest to feed this many lions, but the point is there are a lot more wildebeest than there are lions. And that's because of that small proportion of energy being transferred along the chain. So your grass being eaten by your wildebeest being eaten by your lion. So this is why it's the energy being lost from the system, from that chain. Energy isn't lost, it's still there somewhere, but it's not in here, it's out here somewhere. And of course, as I was saying, the waste is utilised by other organisms. So carrying capacity, this is not something that I mentioned in my key terms, but the availability of that biomass is a limit on the number of organisms that can be at each trophic level. And the maximum number, that's your carrying capacity. So why might some ecosystems have a higher carrying capacity than others? And you've got a couple of pictures there to help you come up with an answer to that. Think about that, and then, having thought about it, restart the video and move on. So, mostly it's down to the productivity of the producers. If they are less productive or they are less abundant, and those things are affected by temperature, water, availability of nutrients. You can see there's not so many plants here compared to here. There isn't the availability of nutrients over here. Up here, obviously, there's a different temperature, a lower temperature. So these things, and again, you need to be able to say that these are the factors that affect the carrying capacity of an environment. So, clearly, the amount of food affects the abundance. If there are more rabbits, there can be more foxes. And the variations in population are going to be affected by a lot of things, including, of course, the reproductive rate. Rabbits reproduce much more quickly than foxes do, for example. So why would the fox population grow more slowly than the rabbit population? Well, partly because they reproduce more slowly and they have fewer offspring at a time. I said we would look at graphs, and here is a graph of the hare and lynx population around Hudson Bay, I suppose, as the Hudson Bay Company between 1845 and 1940. I wonder whether the reason the data doesn't go beyond 1940 is because they managed to more or less get rid of the lynx. But that's just a thought on my part. So you can see how the hare population varies, and you can see how the lynx population varies as well. So you have a peak in the lynx population and you have a trough, a dip in the hare population. You can see as the hare population rises, there's a delay, but then the lynx population rises. So you can see there is a correlation, there is a link between the lynx and the hare population, naturally enough. And you can see how they go in cycles. High point, low point, high point, low point, high point, low point. So we were talking about stable communities early on in the lesson, and you can see how the definition of stable community is being followed here. These populations are going in cycles. Population of the prey and the predator. So, select one of the letters, explain and describe what's happening in the graph. So think about that, and then having paused the video, restart the video and see the answers. So if we look at the green one, you can see there's a large increase in the hare population, and you can see that the lynx population increases, but it takes some time. And then a decrease in lynx population follows a decrease in their prey. That kind of makes sense. If there aren't enough hares to support the lynx population, then some of the lynx are not going to make it. And of course, you have time between the lynx being well fed and the lynx then being able to successfully reproduce to increase the size of the population. It does take time for that to happen. So that's why there's a delay between the increase in the hare population and the increase in the lynx population. So back to our key terms then. There they are again. You should have been defining photosynthesis, biomass, food chain, food web. I didn't say what these words meant. So mean, that's your average. So you take all your numbers, add them together, divide by the total number of them that you have. So if you have 5 pieces of data, let's say they were all, if you had 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, you'd add them all together and divide by 5 because you have 5 pieces of data. That's your mean, your average. Your median, well, if you were to write all of your numbers in order size, the median would be the middle one. And the mode, that's the one that happens most often, the one that comes up most often. The producer, we've defined. Consumer, well, you've got primary, secondary, quaternary, tertiary and quaternary, consumers, predator and prey, stable community. We've defined all those. Hopefully you got those. And if you didn't, there you have the answers to those. So if you haven't got them all, you might choose to pause the video and write those into your notes now. Finally then, on Classroom you have a worksheet that's for you to do and submit for me to see, please. And I will leave you with the similarities and differences between parasites and predators.